Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moscow Financial Forum and this panel, which is about the prospects for the Russian economy and for Russian capital markets. I'm really delighted to say that we have a very, very distinguished panel of speakers with us here today. I'll introduce them in order in which they're seated here. So first of all, we have Mikhail Zadornov, Chairman of the Management Board of Otkritie Bank, Xiaoding Tang, General Director of GF Holdings. We then have Mr. Maxim Oreshkin, Minister of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. Sitting next to him, of course, is Mr. Vladimir Kolychev, Deputy Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation. And next to him is Mr. Alexander Afanasyev, Chairman of the Executive Board of the Moscow Exchange. And last but absolutely not least, Mr. Alexei Zaborkin, Director of the Monetary Policy Department of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and I'm sure we're all very much looking forward to the discussion. So the title of the panel, of course, Prospects for the Russian Economy and for Russian Capital Markets. As I'm sure you're all aware, Russia is an economy with decent growth, contained inflation, and of course a budget surplus. But the big question on investors' minds is what happens in the worst-case scenario of more US sanctions, namely sanctions on new sovereign debt and also sanctions that affect Russian state banks. And of course, we can't ignore the context of a more broad emerging market sell-off at the moment. So with all that in mind, let's get straight to the panel. And if I could please start with you, Mr. Oreshkin, just to ask you about the prospects for the Russian economy. If we do get the worst-case scenario of sanctions from the US on new sovereign debt, but also sanctions that affect Russian state banks, how much could Russia's growth slow?
Спасибо большое за вопрос.
Well, thank you very much for this question. If we consider the last 2 years, we have quite sustainable economic growth. The tempo is approximately 2%. And even July indicators, when we were talking about sanctions and about other volatility factors, about external market as well, the growth was 1.8%.
I'm not getting the English translation. I'm getting a...
So, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello? Yeah, perfect.
Okay, begin again, please, Minister. So, for Russian...
Well, we have a sustainable economical growth, and as I have already mentioned, July showed the growth of 1.8%. This was the month when we had high volatility at external markets, and we had a lot of discussions connected with sanctions as well. What is actually the idea of this sustainable growth, this sustainable macroeconomical indicators? And this year we expect budget surplus around 1% of GDP. We have very positive estimations and hopes. The current growth is more than 2%. We have low external debt, and this differentiates Russia from other developing countries. And the problems that we face now in Argentina, in Turkey, in Brazil, in South Africa, these are all the results of macroeconomical problems that these countries faced last years. And it's quite clear that sanctions story cannot make us very sure, but it actually adds some negative investment dynamics. It influences the mood negatively, so to speak. But actually, in the conditions of sustainable macroeconomical situations, it only brings some kind of volatilities, but doesn't bring a situation dramatically.
To growth, through what channel would that occur in the Russian economy? Would it be because of an increase in inflation that hits consumers because of a weaker ruble, for example?
Well, see, as I have already said, the main factor is the change of the mood. When any negative thing is discussed, it always makes someone delete investments or somehow delay investments and has some short-term negative effect, naturally. And if we consider our estimates for this year, of course, it's 1/10. We decreased our forecast because on the one hand, the true information was stronger than we expected, but there is kind of uncertainty which is growing, and this this definitely makes us be very careful about making forecasts and decrease tempos a little bit in our forecast. Then the increase of long-term interest rate, and if just a couple of months again for 10 years it was less than 7%, and now it's almost 9%, and it starts influencing actually the whole banking system. And we see for the first months that we have statistic growth of mortgage interest rate, and it can negatively influence corporative credits, and it can actually influence economic activity in a negative way. But the third factor, which we cannot but mention, is that the negative effect, which will be due to the increase of value-added tax, and it will happen since the 1st of January 2019, and the budget expenses will be connected with the third and second quarters of the next year, and there will be kind of period of time, especially the first quarter will be the most complicated time for us, when we'll have a more complicated and more strict budget politics, when long-term interest rate increased and budget expenses will not be directed to economical sphere. So we have short-term negative effects on economy, but it will help to decrease inflation, because we can see that even now with the kind of problems with the ruble exchange rate, the basic inflation is still below the level of 4%.
Point, if I could turn to you, please, Mr. Alexei Zabotkin. I understand that inflation is currently well below 4%, but do you foresee it going above that target at any point in 2019, perhaps by the second quarter?
Well, first of all, good morning. And I should say that the forecast of the central bank are being recorrected now before the session of board of directors, and we will have new forecast published based on monetary politics in the evening of 14th of September. And if we met on 17th, for example, I could speak in a more detailed way. As it was mentioned by Chair, on Tuesday we could see that inflation is getting back to the target of 4% a little bit faster than we planned before, but it's out of the question, is one of the factors which we will consider definitely.
In that sense, then, there are a lot of questions by investors whether we could see the first rate hike since 2014. And there was a signal, as you've alluded to, from Ms. Elvira Nabiullina, that this could be a possibility next week. How much of a possibility that there is a rate hike next week?
No. She never comments about the decisions to be taken, and I can only repeat what she has said 2 days ago, that actually we do see a lot of factors and a lot of arguments pro the keeping the same rate, but during the last 3 or 4 weeks we had additional factors which actually make it possible for the board of directors to include for their consideration on the 14th the issues of increase of the rate.
Mr. Kolychev, if I could turn to you, and thank you again to the Finance Ministry for hosting this financial forum and the panel as well. To go back to the issue of the impact of sanctions, let's start with worst case scenario 1, which could be sanctions on new sovereign debt. What steps will you take if these sanctions materialize?
First of all, we have a number of tracks here. The first one, which we should not forget, is that we have automatic stabilizers, which actually, depending on the level of the exchange rate and the ratio between the exchange rate in comparison with the forecast, can influence the amount of necessary sources of financing. And of course our program, and this is counter-cycling component which is within the budget policy, and if we see that the exchange rate is much below the forecast, well, normally it is connected with the capital outflow, for example, from the market of shares, and this is automatic stabilizer which decrease the necessary source of financing for federal budget, including those for sovereign debt. But Besides, there is a large spectrum of actions which government, together with the central bank, can implement in case of such discrete actions. And here, first of all, the government is quite comfortable, and the Ministry of Finance is quite comfortable from the point of view of flexibility for the program of credit. And if we see that at some point there are some stresses at the market, when the structure of demand for our shares should be adapted to new conditions, for example, because the share of non-resident will decrease or it will not grow as it used to grow before, then in this case we will not have any necessity to press over primary market, and this is the tactics that we already used during last quarter, even for a longer time. And actually this will help for the market to be more adjustable to the changes of demand structure at the shares market. But if we see some extreme stress, when at a very short period of time the level of supply and demand at the shares market will be disbalanced a lot, and we can consider some operations at the secondary market. Those can be considered by the central bank as well as to mandate of provision for financial stability if they view any risks for this front. And they also be considered by Ministry of Finance as those who provide loans which can be profitable at some levels. Well, actually to pay at a lower price for their credits, for their loans. Well, just one thing, I would like to add a small thing for you to understand how sustainable financial situation in Russia is. The liquidity balance that the government, that the state has, can allow Russia to stay for 1 year without any loans at all. So here we have quite a good buffer. And I would like to add even more. For now, we have liquid finance as 3 trillions. Those are deposits in banks and other instruments which can bring profits, and also the finances which are in central bank accounts. And on average, this is from 2 to 3 trillions, and this will be more than enough for us up to the end of 2019 in the most stressful situation. And of course, we do not believe that this will happen, but we do have considerable level of comfort from the point of view of liquidity buffer.
I ask then, Mr. Kolychev, you have cancelled a number of ruble bond auctions this year. Why?
Yes, namely because we could see that in the market is getting adapted to new conditions. The structure of demand is changing, and this is accompanied by reassessment of prices at the share market. And for this time, a temporary reassessment when the level of stress is increased and the volatility level is increased at financial market. We do not want to increase this volatility, and we are very careful at primary market. And I would like to add that it's very important to understand that during the last 6 or 12 months, the market of state shares changed a lot from the point of view of the structure of demand. If 1 year ago foreign investors bought a lot of new placements, now all the new placements, and including the reduction of positions which is shown by foreign investors, is bought out by Russian banks. The structure of demand has changed, and when such serious changes taking place, this is quite a complicated situation for the market, and thus we see the increase of profit. And Ministry of Finance is very careful about this, as mentioned by Vladimir, in order not to multiply this volatility during the structural changes.
To the issue of government borrowing and sanctions on new sovereign debt, but I just want to talk to bring in Mr. Zadornov here as well about the second worst case scenario, which would be possible sanctions that affect Russian state banks. What impact broadly would that have on the Russian financial sector, just to begin?
Well, thank you for this question. And every question you start with the worst scenario. Well, but life shows that actually it's not always about the extreme points, and I do not believe the worst scenario that you are talking about, not from the sovereign debt, not from the sanctions for all these sanctions. I don't believe for kind of ideas. I know quite well how Russian Parliament works and how U.S. Congress operates, and I don't believe that the initiative that was announced in July and was carefully analyzed by the market now will be taken in the way as it was presented to the Congress. The second thing is that, well, there are quite clear-cut positions of U.S. Treasury, which was shown by in 2014 after the first wave of sanctions, and even now. I would like to explain with an example. I would like to remind you that in 2014, with the sanctions, we had some specific limitations connected with international payment systems, including it influenced the work of Russia as well, and after some period of time, actually, there was understanding of the heads of payment system Visa and MasterCard. They realized, and the American Ministry of Finance actually resulted to some corrections of this position. And I can say that basically, in principle, international financial institutions, well, quite clearly understand that introduction of some serious sanctions, the example of Russia, against some developed financial market would be counterproductive. First of all, for the very Ministry of Finance of the USA. And the positions here is quite clear-cut. Well, I don't think it will change dramatically for the nearest months. In the same way, it's quite hard for me to imagine the sanctions against all the state banks, even though it's quite clear that if we view the market already included the decrease of shares of Sberbank and VTB, and we see the increase of some foreign stocks of banks, and these risks are already included into the price to this or that extent with some kind of overlap, so to say. But the market decided actually that there will be some package of sanctions, but actually this will not be the extreme scenario. This must be just taken into consideration. Well, actually, the market, on having sold part of the bonds from a residential package, already the shares of Sberbank also decreased because they had quite considerable share of American investors, first of all, in the bonds of the bank. They already corrected for some expectations according to the new situation. And so my idea is that the possible scenario can be less dramatic than it was claimed, and the market is already adjusted to that. And also, I would like to show you two figures. If we analyze the results from August as well, so for the first 8 months of the current year, from the point of view of capital markets, Euro bonds, well, Russian emittents have placed 2 times less than the first months of the previous year. But if we take ruble bonds, then the amount of new emissions is only 13-15% less than that of the previous year. So it's quite clear that at that market, partially, we had the compensation of attraction of finance from external markets. And for Russian banks, it's also not so bad. What didn't work for external that was substituted by internal loan, including that of foreign currency loan, and different to the previous year, there was growth of 5-7% of corporate credit inside Russia. And there is one bad thing about it. Of course, we do understand that actually, the discussion that we have today creates kind of sustainable, indefinite situation for decision-taking, both by large companies and by population as well. And this factor of indefinite situation is actually the basic negative thing from the point of view of slowing down of economical growth tempos through the delay in investment decision-taking.
Mr. Zardonyov. If I could turn to you now, Mr. Afanasyev, on the final point that Mr. Zardonyov made, and I take your point about not always thinking about the worst case scenario, but the point is, as you've just said, that there is still uncertainty, both at the prospect of more US sanctions, but also with the general pullback in other emerging markets. How have those two factors impacted activity on the Moscow exchange?
Honestly speaking, these are not all the bad factors that if you collect them together. Thinking about the economic growth that started, but before some our colleagues in parliament said we had negative growth, I really like that term. Well, we have quite a large volatility. If you think what happened since 2014, remember how the prices for energy products went down and other main products that are exported abroad. But we have some good news as well. And if you think about this impact, let's see how sanctions impacted the Russian economy. And of course, we understand the interest of foreign investors went down. And let us see what kind of interest we had to overall developing markets. So, if you look what was going on since 2014, as for Moscow Stock Exchange, look at the whole volume of sales. If you look at annual growth, it is plus 18%. Maybe there is no other stock exchange in the market that will show plus 18% of growth. And that happens not because of the market decline. And if you look at at ruble's sales as of 2014, that is when sanctions only started. So the ruble index was equal to 56%. The best market right now is American stock market. They have index 57. So of course, many investors look at dollar index, those who would like to invest in dollars. Here we have some negative trend due to ruble weakening, but it is still lower than in Brazil or in Turkey. And if you calculate in dollars, British index, they also have minus 16 or 17%. As for this year, we see the growth, market growth, it is around 11%. It's one of the best figures worldwide. In dollars, it will be minus 4%. Well, but in Germany, it is minus 8%. So it is not a critical indicator, I would say. And we so far do not see the outflow of foreign investors from Russia. And we see that as for secondary transactions, the share of foreign investors has increased. The share of non-residents used to be 38%. Now it is 48%. It used to be 20% when it comes to derivatives. Now it is 47%. And if you look at regions, what non-residents did in terms of the activities in the regions, if you look at the share of ownership of non-residents, we can say that the only region has increased its share. It is certainly the United States. So before the crisis, their share was around 40%. Now it is 55% due to continental Europe. So we have seen the degrees of investment volumes in 2014 and 15 after the first wave of sanction by 40%. From main international funds, and then now this share has grown. In the first quarter of this year, it is equal to 90% of what we had before 2014. Now it has dropped somewhat. So far, the decrease is equal to 10%, but we don't know the data from the third quarter. And we, again, do not expect that it will be 40% decline. The market is adjusting, and as for foreign loans, the decrease was around 12% in 2012, then it went up, then it declined again, and the record number was 34%. So now it is 27%. So it's higher than 2015. So we are doing quite well in this regard. So the market is adjusting, and I believe in the market. Otherwise, I would not work in the stock exchange. And I believe that the market can find the balance between the risks that look scary, that are hard to be calculated, especially when it comes to political risks. As for economic risks, professional investors take them into account into their models. Political risks are hard to be calculated, but we can respond to them. And this is not the only reaction of the market. And if you ask me another question, I will talk about other responses and reactions of the market as well.
Afanasyev, I mean, yes, you make a good point about Russian equities being up about 10, 11% year to date, whereas some other equity markets in the world certainly haven't performed as well, certainly not in some developed markets. However, if we get an exodus of foreign investors from Russian equities because of concerns around sanctions, emerging markets, external factors, let's call them, is there enough domestic demand to pick up that slack and support the Russian equity market?
Вот этого вопроса я и ждал. Как так, вот прям отлично.
That's the question I was waiting for. Thank you very much for it. And as Maxim Stanislavovich said, to switch the channel, and here it's vice versa. Well, we see a great demand in the Russian equities market on the part of domestic investors, especially retail investors, and their behavior is very rational. Starting from last year, they have doubled their transactions. And we are talking about double growth. So we were talking about replacing demand by Russian banks. And of course, there is this additional demand on the part of population. And talking about conservative product, we have double demand for corporate shares. That's what we see when it comes to primary debt. And by 33%, we see the growth in the shares sold to the population. So we, together with regulators, together with government, with the parliament, we develop our legislation, we improve our infrastructure, we add new products, and we have improved the environment. So it's like when you plant seeds, you need rain to water the soil, and you need great motivation. And that happened due to decrease of interest rates for deposits. And it's a very good news for the stock market, and investors who are not really excited about the deposit interest rates. They are looking for other ways to invest, and so they look at the debt capital, and now they're looking at share capital as well. And what also we talked about already, we see the volume of the sovereign debt, because it is larger compared to bank debt. Sorry, Mikhail, about that. And it used to be 20% 8 years ago. Now it is growing, and now it is about 30%. We also see that internal bonds are issued, and they replace Eurobond, and that is increasing the concentration of liquidity, because Eurobond is not a product of Russian stock, while rubles bonds is our national product. And I can give you one figure. Within 3 years, the volume of public debt has increased by 3 times. That went through the Russian stock exchange. Last year, we had 5.3 trillion rubles, and now for 8 months, we have 6.8 trillion rubles. So we have outpaced last year, and we are not talking about short-term bonds, and I'm not taking into the account to have more precise calculation. And we have new people that are willing to buy shares and ready to invest. There are around 300,000 newcomers, let me call them this way, and And so we are talking about new participants. They account for 50% from the whole number of participants. And it means that this is a record number. So we see a greater interest, and it is growing and growing, and it is very heartening for us. I also would like support Alexander so the audience understands that one of our core goals as banks to create mobile applications so you can buy basic products directly at stock exchange. So you can either use our brokers or you can do it directly. So it is a trend, and we are going to give you better opportunities, and you don't have to do it at the office. You can use it by using your digital devices. And I would like to add one more thing. And so as we think about non-residents that all should access the country, of course, there are certain political constraints, and investors have to adjust to them. But once political outcry will stop, investors will look at risks and at profitability that different countries offer to them. And what will they see in Russia? They will see risks that can be compared to such countries as Norway, while profitability is really attractive. So that will attract them to buy our securities. And I think many foreign investors already understand that, and probably they won't wait, and they will be tempted to buy shares. I also would like to add something. The questions from journalists is a very good indicator to make decisions in the financial markets. So when a journalist in each question says what will be the worst scenario, the worst scenario, the worst scenario, so it's time to buy rather than time to sell. Because when the journalists say, is it going well, are you doing well, are you doing okay, then it's a signal that probably it makes sense to sell something.
Speculating about what investors think. Let's actually find out and turn to Mr. Tang. And it's great to have you as the sole non-resident as well on the panel. So, Mr. Tang, just generally, as an investor living outside of Russia, how do you see the prospects for Russia's economy and Russia's capital markets?
Yeah, I think the general consensus sometimes can be misleading. I'm relatively new to Russian capital market, but from what I heard, things are not that bad. You have positive GDP growth. You have budget surplus. The inflation is within control. The external debt is limited compared to other emerging market. And you talk about potential rate high. So it's gonna, further stabilize the ruble. So with all those factors going on, I think it can mitigate the potential impact of the sanctions. In China, you're facing similar, if not even dire, situation with the U.S.-China trade wars. We also talk about the devaluation of the local currency, the credit event, over the last 10 years, the injection of the liquidity to the market that create some credit bubbles. So we're all facing different challenges. But in my opinion, there are a lot of different ways that maybe international investor can help. For example, we heard people talk about the RMB denominated Russian sovereign bond issuing through the stock exchange. We have different stock exchange. Hong Kong, Shanghai Stock Connect. We have Hong Kong Shenzhen Stock Connect. And by the end of this year, we're going to have Shanghai London Stock Connect, and then we have Bond Connect. With the I think with the current yield of sovereign debt, if denominated in RMB, without taking the currency risk, it'd be quite popular, a product for the for the investors in China. For equity market, I think just people in China generally they don't know much about the market here. So my suggestion is to have some of the roadshows like what we did back in 2012 when I used to work for the state financial regulators. We actually went on a roadshow to U.S., Canada, Europe, and Middle East, Southeast Asia, to talk about the market, to talk about the economy, to talk about the market infrastructures. So from 2012 to 2017, it took us 5 years for Asia to be finally included into MSM emerging market indices. Now we represent 5% of the indices, and through the inclusion through Stock Connect, we have accumulated altogether $80 billion of inflow from international investors into China's Asia market.
Mr. Tang, how exposed is GF Holdings to Russia and to Russian assets?
Currently, we don't have much exposure to Russia. Again, we need it's a long process. One figure that I found really encouraging is that in 2017 there were 1.5 million tourists from China to Russia, and that number is the highest among all the countries in the world. The tourists into China, and it's growing. So first, the people, the visitors come to Russia. They probably like the culture, like the food, like the shopping, but eventually the business people they will come here. They start to dig deeper into the market. They try to understand the economy, try to understand the market, and sooner or later they'll find the attractiveness of some of the capital instruments, like the sovereign debt, like certain sectors of the market.
But what's holding GF Holdings back from investing in Russia more right now, if you see it as fairly positive compared to other emerging markets?
I think it's just from the lack of understanding of the local investors.
Right.
Again, that we need education. We need aggressive or active marketing about the Russian market.
Okay. In terms of sort of marketing about the Russian market, as it were, then, what more can the finance ministry to do with regard to that, Mr. Kolychev?
Well, I guess visit China more often then.
Yeah, we actually do. We have visits.
English is fine with me.
У нас было несколько визитов.
Actually, we did have a number of visits, and we talked to offshore investors from China, and yes, there are certain restrictions that Chinese regulators impose on the capital flows, especially when it comes to black investors, and we see certain interests on the part of investors, but there are regulatory constraints that gradually will be loosened, and hopefully in the near future we will see offshore investors in our market as well. And onshore already here, we are talking about Hong Kong investors, and they really know Russian market quite well.
With investors, Mr. Zadornov, what do you sort of hear from foreign investors about Russian state banks and investing in Russian banks?
I think it's just, we generally get the information from...
Oh, it was for Mr. Zadornov, but you're welcome to follow.
Вы знаете,
First of all, traditionally, there was a large share that remains of non-residents that invest in euro bonds of the Russian banks. Another thing that the volume of those European bonds over the past 18 months, for very obvious reasons, goes down. And if we talk about free float of shares of Russian banks, where the lion's shares falls on Sberbank, the savings bank of Russia, then the share of American investors would reach 35 to 40% of the shares. I think that right now the situation is changing, but I would agree with Maxim by saying that when the market decides that uncertainty is gone, I think the investors will come back and start buying the shares and bonds of the Russian banks, because the volume of corporate debt in hard currency went down, and there should be understanding that risks are gone, and that's the most important thing in terms of their confidence and redirecting the flow of foreign investors.
To jump in?
No, I mean, I think, going back to more marketing effort of Russia's, financial market, I, got involved with the Stock Connect between Hong Kong and China, the Stock Connect between London and Shanghai. So I guess my suggestion is this it will take different group of people's effort, not just limited to the intro government level. We need the stock exchange level. We need investors, financial intermediaries level, all work together to make it happen. Otherwise, it's just limited to the MOU level.
Mr. Oreshkin, I just want to talk a little bit about state company dividends versus investments. So the government says annual investments need to rise by 19 trillion rubles from current levels by 2024 to meet the president's target for raising the share in GDP. I believe the aim for overall investment is to be a quarter of GDP. Will you let state companies pay less dividends in order for them to spend more on investments?
Well, see, we are talking about the fact that we need investments not to some specific year. This should be a long-term story which will result in long-term increase of economical growth tempos. And it's not only important to mention the amount of investments, but also the qualities of investments. This is value added which they create in economy. That is their payback. And when we're talking about state companies, about other companies, there is an important indicator is a rent of investments. And if the investment project has a vast number of effects which goes outside some specific companies, like with infrastructural projects, this state, of course, can provide supports. And we should understand that every ruble which we have in the profit of the company, these are state money. And here, we should take decisions about how to use this means from the point of view of achieving maximum level of payback for the invested capital. And it's important to finish the work with audit of investment program of state companies in order to understand which efficiency will be received by the state by every ruble invested. When we see this, then the state can take decisions whether it's right to support these investments, or in this case, the investments will be of low profit and they should not be supported.
On, because in about 15 minutes I will be opening the questions out to the floor, so do think of any questions that you might want to ask our distinguished panelists in about 15 minutes' time. But I want to continue just by talking about the weakness of the ruble. When we look at it from the perspective of sitting in the UK or in Western Europe, we talk about it being one of the worst performing emerging market currencies this year. I believe it's the 5th worst, but a lot of conversations I've had here, I get pushed back and I'm told it's actually not one of the worst performing. So obviously that's a point that we can disagree on potentially. But in terms of the weakness of the ruble, the central bank halted FX purchases under the budget rule on the market until at least the end of September. So, Mr. Zabotkin, if I could ask you, about this. So at least until the end of September, is there a more specific, real deadline than that for halting these FX purchases?
Центральный банк
Well, a central bank has specified its position in a very transparent manner and in a very specific manner in a press release which was published in August. And the purchases were stopped till the end of September, and they will be recovered based on the observation over dynamics of financial markets within the September. Since the beginning of September, we had only 6 days. Out of them, it's only 4th working day. Well, I cannot say anything specific. It's too early now. But at that, I would like to emphasize that all the obligations on selling the foreign currency, the central bank performs in full amount.
In terms of making the decision with beginning those foreign exchange purchases again, I know you've said you'll observe the market, but is there a specific level of the ruble where you would then be comfortable with resuming those FX purchases?
Центральный
A central bank does not target any specific nominal level of exchange rate. That is why the answer is no. So we consider for a quite broad spectrum of indicators, first of all, volatility indicators, and if during September there will be kind of decrease of volatility on Russian market, first of all, at global markets up to the levels which we could see before August situation, then the purchases will be recovered.
Mr. Kolychev, are you concerned at all that moves like this, and I know that there are a lot of nuances that I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, but are you concerned that for international investors, the budget rule might lose some credibility because of moves like this that are based on a weakening ruble?
Нет, и
No, and actually this is the communication that we were trying to arrange at the market, not only for foreign investors and basically for all economical agents. The budget rule was created not to with the only purpose to decrease the dependence on dynamics of oil prices, interest rate, inflation, and then along with the whole chain. And all the remaining targets connected with financial stability, be it high or low volatility at financial markets, well, everything is a mandate of central bank, and they use the tools that they have. And within this, the specific distinction of mandates between budget rule and operations of the central bank, well, actually provides the transparency, as we think, for investors to be able to understand that this rule is so strict and only in order to decrease the dependence from oil prices, and all discrete decisions are connected with the mandate of financial stability from central bank.
Mr. Oreshkin, do you foresee the ruble going beyond 80 anytime soon?
я помню, был
Oh, well, I remember in 2015 the situation was much more volatile, and there was the same question, but the level was 100, and I said that they will not be 100. So now I wouldn't expect any considerable changes. If you see our forecast, which we prepared first in July, now we are renewing that, and our forecast for exchange rate for the period of 2020 will be almost the same. We do not see any long-term reason for something for ruble to fall down dramatically. Yes, of course, there is current volatility, as I have already mentioned. Well, I cannot say that ruble is the weakest currency. Well, it's like an anecdote. When Brezhnev is running a marathon cross, and they say that his opponent was the last but one, and they were 2 runners only, and Brezhnev was had the winning position, the second place. Well, actually, out of 2, and so the ruble 5th from the end out of 6 currencies. Well, Well, actually, let us see what happens to Turkish lira, with Argentine peso, with South American rand, with Brazilian real, with Indian rupee, especially during recent weeks. Well, the situation is much worse there, and the problems there are of structural character. And in Russia, of course, we understand that there is a sanction story which actually adds nervousness to investors. There are volatility aspects which have a very short-term character. So when we changed our forecast for exchange rate, we made it weaker for the nearest 12 months. We do see that the capital outflow will be more than we expected before, but our long-term estimates are still the same, because the long-term course is based on two things: on budget rule, which provides for stability regardless of the oil prices level, and inflation targeting, which provides for long-term stability of inflation at low level. It can forecast dynamics of exchange rate for long-term perspective.
That the focus of this panel is the Russian economy and Russian capital markets, but you have mentioned Turkey, Brazil a couple of times. What can countries like Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, to some extent South Africa as well, learn from Russia?
Ну, вывод очень
Well, the conclusion is very simple. Any economical policy should be, first of all, based on long-term purposes, on long-term stability of indicators. It's impossible to take long-term effects through taking short-term decisions, because these short-term decisions always have to be paid for.
As well, Mr. Zabotkin, we talked earlier about the possibility or not of rate hikes. Do Russian real rates actually mean that the central bank doesn't need to rush to hike?
На сегодня реальная
Well, for today, the real rate is, well, depending on which inflation we consider. If we see our target inflation of 4%, then the real state is 3.25, which can be considered as actually neutral credit conditions. And the assessment of central bank as to neutral exchange rate is within interval of 6 or 7%. We are almost on the upper level of this interval. At the same time, as we claimed in June press release in a report of monetary policy, central bank is expecting, while considering our risk assessment and assessment of economical dynamics, that monetary policy will remain moderately rigid for some period of time, at least up to 2019.
Bloomberg has written a couple of stories about the fact that the market and also Russia Inc., if we want to call it that, seem to some extent to be tightening financial conditions, despite the fact that we haven't had a hike from the Bank of Russia. What does this tell us that we're seeing that in the market, separate from what the central bank is doing?
Я бы сказал,
Well, I would say that basic change of the previous months due to a number of factors is as follows. The market is already understanding that there will be no further decrease of nominal rates. Moreover, basic banks, including Открытие, de facto, during last weeks, we already raised internal rates from the increase of rates for credit products, trying to consider competition, which is quite serious in bank sector. This is plus for client, but it's quite obvious that within several months we expect the rates for clients to be growing, and I believe that it will not happen very rapidly. And now clients face very good time to take a loan for nearest months, and then further on it will depend upon external conditions, which we have already mentioned today, as well as the market will view the decision of central bank. So whether we'll see any changes in movements of central bank rate, the colleagues understand it. This will be a clear-cut signal for banks for further movements of rates, for further changing of rates. And now for clients, we didn't have this kind of increase, but it's quite clear that till the end of the year, it will be accompanied with some moderate growth depending on products, I believe approximately by 0.5%. And then it will depend on whether the rate will remain on the same level, let us say till the end of first quarter of the next year, or will it be some further increase of rates?
Final question to Mr. Afanasyev before I open it out to the floor. When we talk about emerging markets more broadly and the word contagion comes up, it's not only contagion between different geographies, but also contagion between asset classes. So the focus has been very much on currencies recently, and then we talk about contagion to equities, etc. The weakness in the ruble, how does that feed through to any potential contagion of other asset classes in Russia, particularly as we've already talked about the fact that Russian equities are up 10% this year?
Тут разные влияния есть вообще.
Here we have different influences, increase or decrease of ruble or any national currency influences different sectors in a different way. Now we see quite unique story when simultaneously quite weak ruble and at the same time we have quite high oil prices. Before that we had direct correlations between these two indicators, which actually increase the attractiveness of raw material companies exporter, and the weakness of ruble as foreign investors, whom we still have quite a lot at financial markets, when they consider dollar profit, well, it often influences the immediate movement of ruble index and the change in ruble prices, and it increases availability of ruble and creates kind of additional attractiveness for a number of investors and for a number of participants. And actually, the ratios can be different. Well, the problem is not to what extent ruble is weak or strong. If it's stable, it's even worse. Because the problem is why it happens and which is the tempo. Because only one change per day or per week up to a couple of percent. Well, yes, it adds some uncertainty to the market and uncertainty to investors. But when it happens quite smoothly and some volatility, of course, should be present, I believe that investor is too spoiled nowadays with the stability of national currency, and Bank of Russia is not putting any targets related to the exchange rate, but the exchange rate was even unhealthy stable. It didn't move for quite a long period of time at all. So some volatility is actually quite normal and natural. I repeat, if it's not a shock. So a market is always scared of shock. And what you have mentioned regarding the contagious of market by one another, well, of course, markets of all the world are interconnected, and we being one of the part of this global financial world, well, I believe that where almost the main trend of the last decade is that market is becoming globalized in trading, and that localization in listing. So market becomes more domestic for emittents and more international for investors. Thus, it's a good trend that we view and we mention here in Russia as well. And one more thing I would like to say. I believe in a resistance of market. It was mentioned a lot about sanctions, about other phenomena, how they influence our companies. Well, of course, it's not the best decade for financial market or the first 5 years for financial market, but mention the dividends. The profit of dividends of Russian companies index is the highest at developing market, and before that everybody was complaining that Russian companies do not pay dividends. It was like 6.4%, whereas the nearest one is 4 point something percent. Countries like Brazil or Turkey. Well, I believe this is influence of some complications. In order to support the attractiveness for investors, emittents actually create policies, dividend policies. It's not only that they paid money, but that transparency is in policy, and they calculated, they share profit with investors. And we actually improved corporate management and so on. Well, I do believe that the market through these complications becomes deeper and more mature, which I believe happens here in Russia.
Great note to end on as we move to questions. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and we will come to you with a mic. And say if your question is for somebody in particular or if you're addressing it to everyone. Any questions?
Всем все понятно.
Yes.
It's clear for everyone. Well, Igor Susin, Gazprom. Well, my question is to central bank. In the current situation, the central bank made a claim that which actually indicates more attention to inflation. Well, to what extent are you going to consider true rigidness of financial condition which happens in the market, including increase of rates at loan market, increase of rates of banks, and to what extent are you going to consider the fact that the stop of intervention will in this or that way actually takes out liquidity from the market at taking decision for exchange rate?
Thank you very much. It is a very valid comment. Of course, we are going to take into account all the factors and talking about increasing rigidity of credit terms and conditions. As speakers were saying earlier, of course, it is taking pace and it is rather significant, and of course it affects the trajectory of inflation in the midterm, and that will be part of the discussion.
At the back, yes.
Andrei Moroskin from Gazprom Bank. The question to Mr. Tang, I would like to hear his focus about what is going on in Russia for the next year, his forecast for the next year.
Probably asked the wrong guy. But, you know, to be honest, I think given all the things, all the uncertainty in the world, I think the situation here is you know, definitely not that bad. We have exposure to Turkey, to Brazil, to South Africa, because we're betting the volatility of the currency is gonna go higher, but we don't bet anything against the volatility of ruble, because we think the economic fundamental indicators are relatively strong, and also with the energy price is higher than a couple of years ago. So we don't see a imminent pressure on the currency. Of course, the sanction is the external factor that we need to worry about that. But that factor is really hard to quantify. So that's why I think that at least from our point of view, we don't see a huge negative development down the road, especially in the short term. Again, with the sovereign yield at a very attractive level and the potential rate hike, if we can come up with some innovative financial product, potentially it can attract some strong interest from international investor communities, particularly from China.
Я вот когда сейчас услышал, что
When I heard right now that you can invest to Turkey and to Brazil. I felt a bit scared. You probably have nightmares because you have so many investments. For you to understand what is going on in Russia better and to feel more comfortable, we recommend that you increase the share of your Russian assets in your portfolio.
On my side, yeah. Thank you for your advice.
Okay. Okay, two gentlemen, one in the middle, and then to you, sir.
Oleg Kachkarsa from BKS. Mr. Afanasyev has pointed to two right terms. There is a motivation for the private investors, and we are the facilitators for the investors in the Russian market, and we hope this trend will continue. A question to Mr. Kolochin. Are you going to introduce additional stimulus? And we know that there is an initiative related to remove the foreign currency reassessment, and we understand that the government would like to stimulate their monetary policy, but we would like to understand whether it will extend to private corporations as well, because all the investors would like to diversify their investment portfolio. And we understand as for dividends, we have a large issuer who doesn't want to pay 50% of dividends. That's Gazprom. In terms of efficiency, and that is what Maxim Stanislavich was talking about, when it comes to capitalization, and Novatek that produces less gas, but his capital would grow. Maybe they should pay more dividends. Are you going to see any progress in this regard or not? Thank you very much for your question. Talking about reassessments, maybe the investors should look at ruble instruments, financial instruments, and they will be more attractive, and you do not do any reassessment here. Well, anything can happen to various currencies, so be more cautious in this regard. Well, being serious. We will look into this matter, and this is an initiative, and there is a law on reassessing sovereign bonds as for dividends. We were moving towards developing our general policy about talking about 50% of minimum level for all state public companies. And 3 years ago, people were laughing at this initiative. And right now, the majority, apart from those that were mentioned by you, switched to this policy. And as Maxim said, with some companies that may be more difficult, nevertheless, our goal is to make sure that we get 50% minimum, and the idea is to increase the share of the state as the shareholder, and we don't want the state to act only as a regulator on the industry of this sector. So we'd like to play other roles, and so we'd like to make more decisions in dividend policy, in debt policy, in the policy of managing funds, and so on.
Then I will come to the front. Yeah.
Ovechkin, you spoke about liquidity buffer and potential policy measures under assuming a risk case scenario. So assuming this risk case scenario, can Russia be self-funded, Russia sovereign to be self-funded?
Бояться не надо, все будет хорошо. Наши потребности в
Don't be scared, everything will be good. And our demand for self-financing is around 1.5% per year. And if you compare it to the scale of our financial system and the capacity of bank system, and I think it is able to process this volume, and it's not a relatively small share if you look at the annual growth of credit portfolio, even in the same bank sector. Therefore, do not feel cautious.
Long term, we're looking obviously at potential growth of Russia, and there are a number of measures the president announced and your ministry is working on. How do you see potential growth after next year, VAT introduction and pension reform? Thank you.
Ну вот смотрите, сейчас мы последние 1,5 года, как я говорил,
As we said, we are in the scale between 1 to 1.5. If we look at the issue for one able-bodied person, then it is in line with the global indicator. So, to make sure that the growth of economy will continue, we need to focus on the following. First of all, we need to change the dynamics of able-bodied population, and pension reform will play a positive role in this regard. And we hope that there will be continuing inflow of migration, and we will make sure that the quality of migration of labor force will improve. We also will think that these factors will have a positive effect on employment. Talking about investments, we would like to increase investment and increase their share in GDP structure. And we have improved the plan to increase investments aimed at improving the investment environment. And thirdly, the increase of labor productivity, especially productivity that is not related to investment activity, but related to improving the management mechanisms. And we have several projects. One is focused on labor productivity, and we would like to introduce new culture of corporate governance, and it should improve the labor productivity. So if we focus on these 3 points, this is something what should improve gradual growth of economy, and we hope that we will reach 3% of growth by 2021, when the investment activity will be close to what we planned for. Thank you, Olga Domilente, Prosperity Capital Management. I have 2 questions. One to Alexander Afanasyev. You provided lots of interesting statistics, and do you have any statistics about the percentage of reinvestments of dividends that Russian companies pay? So we'd like to know what percent is reinvested in the Russian stock market and within which period. And then I have another question for Maxim Oreshkin. Could you please tell me, you just have mentioned the infrastructure companies that they can have play a different role, and in terms of dividends, they can also practice a different approach. Can you talk in detail about that? So I would like to know what you think about the role of infrastructure companies, and so yeah, can you dwell on that? Thank you. Well, I will talk about the percentage of reinvestments. We do not have such statistics because investors themselves do not have this statistics, because we talk about large investment funds. Their flow consists of, the statistics is very various in terms of flow and outflow, inflow and outflow. So they don't have such a statistics that this investment had happened because this dividend was paid or not. But I can make certain conclusions based on what we observe. The increase of dividend payments, as a rule, increase the inflow of new funds in the market, and it increases and there is not only technical reason, but it happens because the attractiveness of the company goes up, and the company becomes more transparent, and they demonstrate larger responsibility for the investors. And Mr. Chkasov was talking about certain particular cases, but we believe that the Russian companies indeed show better trend. Talking about the second question, I'm not saying that certain companies should practice a specific, unique approach. I'm talking about a very simple thing. Profitability of any public company belongs to the state, and we need to look at the conditions they use for reinvestments and what the profitability is. But there are some narrow projects within the industry, and then the state takes their profitability, but there are infrastructure projects as well. And then the income consists of not only from the profit they receive, but we also look at the general effect on the economy, because when you build roads or railroads, they provide large and long-term effects, and you develop the economy around the infrastructure object, and then there is an added effect. So when the government makes a decision to reinvest part of the funds into infrastructure projects, we need to assess this general effect on the economy, not only the effects that will take place within the company. And not long ago, we have prepared a new methodology to assess social and economic effects that will include that added value the economy will receive, the additional tax payments the government will receive. And by using this methodology, we will get a better picture and about each infrastructure project, because we have various infrastructure projects. We have projects that do not provide large external effects, and they support certain investment projects. For instance, these are projects related to exporting coal, and here we have either pure business or transit. And here there are not large effects, but when we talk about some transportation projects, building roads, here the external effects are significant, and yes, you need to take them into account to make decisions.
Does anyone else have questions? I think after this one we'll have time for maybe one more, and then I'd like to go back to the panel for final thoughts. So one question at the back, and then gentleman in the middle.
Здравствуйте, вопрос Михаилу Михайловичу, Анатолий Курманаев, Wall Street.
The question to Alex Mikhailovich, and how the sanctions affect the everyday bank activities. Well, in terms of everyday activities, do bank employees sleep well? Yes, sure, there's no problems. But I know that the customers, certainly, especially the customers that have deposits in foreign currencies, think, and they analyze and take into account various scenarios, of course, and this is something what you wouldn't deny. Sorry, the interpreter cannot hear a comment without the microphone. We are taking account all the scenarios. Of course, after 2014, we have introduced a number of infrastructure changes. I'm not going to list all of them, but it is clear that we have the Mir bank payment system. We have our settlement payment autonomous system that works efficiently, and there are a number of infrastructure measures that took place, and you cannot protect you from all possible events, but I do not believe in the worst scenario. I think, in my opinion, you need to just look at what is going on and take actions. And I think it's very important to overcome the uncertainty that has place, and hopefully by the end of the year, we will have the elections to Congress, and at that point we will receive a larger certainty in terms of political situation in the United States. Thank you very much. The Association of Russian Banks And yes, we understand the central bank made a great deal of work by decreasing the inflation rate lower than 4%. At the same time, if we look at the credit rates, the mortgage have a general interest rate of 10%. The rate to small businesses over 12%. Mikhail said, I'm sorry, talking about mortgage interest rate, it is around 9.4, no, 9.6, no, it's 9.4%. This is historically lowest. Yes, okay, I agree with that. But if you look at real interest rate adjusted to the inflation, it's around 6%. So, as for the Ministry of Economic and Development, does it believe that is it a real credit interest rate, and does it cause any problems? And if so, are you going to take any measures to decrease the real interest rate for loans? Well, the problem I see, it's not even the level of credit interest rates, but the structure of demand, because it determines the structure of demand in the economy as a whole. And as for the consumer credits, consumer loans, here we see quite robust development. And for you to understand the impact on the economy as for sector of non-secured consumer loan, it amounts to 1.3 trillion rubles. So 1% of GDP was generated by demand that comes from non-secured consumer credits. And considering the fact that our target is 6 to 7% per year, then so 1% comes from non-secured crediting, and the structure is something of credits is something what I feel cautious about, because I believe that the structure has a negative effect on the economy and on the economy development. And talking about the level of our percentage rates, the mortgage interest rates are below 10%, significantly below, and as for real rates, they're higher compared to the long-term balance, but they're lower than what we had 2 years ago. So on the part of central bank, we can say that the longer we demonstrate our readiness to maintain inflation around 4%, the lower the interest rate would be.
So I just want to go back to the panel for final thoughts. The conclusion that we seem to have come to is, first of all, that many of you on the panel don't expect the worst case scenario when it comes to sanctions, and in any case you believe that Russia's economy has the tools and the capability to withstand any further shocks from potential US sanctions. However, I just want to ask the same question to all of you, which is about, even though Russia's economy is in a good place now, what are the future risks? Do they come from domestic factors? Do they come from any change in investor sentiment as a result of general escalating trade wars? Do they come from tightening global liquidity conditions with the Federal Reserve raising rates? So in that global context, just the same question to all of you in terms of where do you see the risks to Russia's economy and Russia's capital markets from here?
Well, thank you. I believe that there are two risks. One have already been mentioned briefly, and actually it's very obvious. The outflow of capital from developing market overall and decrease of exchange rate that we view is the trend of strengthening of dollar, and capital outflow from market. Unfortunately, we know that some have double scares of payment balance, and different to Russia, which is quite different, which is quite various here. And unfortunately, investors assess even sustainable markets as Russia as negative. And the second thing, of course, a further increase of exchange rate and potential trade conflicts create a feeling, now only a feeling, that world economy will slow down, and the same feeling of uncertainty about it. And I would like to remind you that 1 year ago there was consensus also of international financial institution, I mean IMF, World Bank, that there will be 1 year, that the year 2018 and 19 will be the most successful from the point of view of global growth. But as we see that the mood has changed quite a lot. And for Russia, I have already mentioned, we are talking about sanctions. The trend, I would like to mention once again, for decrease of inflation, the decrease of rates. Well, for now, we didn't manage to use the results of economy, of decrease of inflation and change of behavior. We mentioned that physical bodies go to market, which is good, and a lot of positive processes which have already been started. But now, in this situation, then they would stop. And that is quite offensive, so to say. And I would like to say that after some time they will continue. Господин Tan?
I think, if I have to pick something, I would say stagflation. With the higher rate, I think there's a possibility, I'm just talking about the statistical stuff, that there's a possibility that growth is going to be negatively impacted by the higher interest rate. At the same time, the potential outflow of the capital potentially can increase the inflation. So we might get into a situation that both the inflation is high and the growth are low. However, I'm pretty impressed by the leadership in the financial market here, particularly by some of the panelists here, from Bank of Russia, Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Economic Development. I think compared to other emerging markets, we have the most transparent leadership, and people truly understand the issues. People really want to communicate with the investor community. So I'm very positively impressed.
Mr. Oreshkin?
Well, external factors, of course, everything related to world economical growth. Well, actually, Mikhail Mikhailovich mentioned that International Monetary Fund, even in their spring statement, said that everything will be all right. But comparing to what we said a year ago about the inevitability of decrease of growth and that the stable cycle is over in some developing countries and in developed countries, and the developing countries actually were doomed to decrease, to slow down, which is happening now. And this is external factor, but it's also important to remember about some internal structural constraints. And I would like to add what we didn't mention today, where we see quite high risks. This is construction industry, this is real estate construction, and the structural changes which are connected to the change of financing model. When we have a direct financing of the population, which is like several trillion rubles, should be substituted by bank loans, and all the bank portfolio is 1.5 trillions. Well, this structural change, I believe that banking system is not ready for that. They are not ready to offer new products. They are not ready to work. They are not ready to provide loans in such a large scale. And this is a task to be solved. And our suggestion for now, and we're actively discussing that, is the creation of special program on the basis of principles that we have for the program for credits for small and mid-sized businesses. So this is the program which will make it possible to stimulate banks to give loans for real estate construction with partial risks for the state. Well, thank you. For investors, the main risk is connected with the fact that they will not be able to use the current opportunity, which created political, so to say, noise for policymakers, that we will be too relaxed, but we are really kept in tonus. Well, please allow me to add another risk to what was mentioned before. It's absolutely obvious that at the stage of new serious challenges, as we have now, these challenges are not only connected to economy or global aspect or geopolitical aspects. And it's very fair to say that like Russian regulators do, that additional measures should be to take management levers into their own hands and to stimulate the strengthening of macroeconomic positions in economic. It's very fair and clear. And there is a risk well, how to put it? We should find a balance where we initiated projects from the point of from behalf of state, with the state bodies, with their own methodologies. Let them be very right, but this should find a balance with the market mechanisms of self-regulation, because you know that market is, well, it should remember that this is a very well self-regulator, and even though sometimes it's too noisy and participants of this market, but one of the most useful there.
Risks for the Russian economy and capital markets, Mr. Zabotkin?
Наверное,
Господин, so, well, actually, I mostly agree with Mr. Kolechev, and well, I would like to remember the quotation from researchers of Antarctics, Ernst Shackleton, who said that
я думаю, что Россия сталкивалась с очень большим
and I believe that Russia faced a lot of difficulties and obstacles in the previous 10 or 15 years, and the external situation which exists now, well, it's quite more complicated than we believed 6 months ago, but I believe that the scale of risks is much less than we had to face before. And at the same time, Russian economy, Russian economical policy, well, they are prepared much better than in a lot of other episodes. So that is why I believe that.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for a stimulating, detailed, and at times humorous panel. We really appreciate all your presence here, and thank you all for your questions as well.